Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we will discuss about meninges. So, the meninges are the membranes that envelop the brain and the spinal cord. So, in the brain, they are referred to as the cranial meninges, and in the spinal cord, they are referred to as the spinal meninges. The cranial meninges, they continue downwards as the spinal meninges. They are continuous with each other and they are three in number. So these membranes, they separate the brain and the spinal cord from their respective bony walls, that is separates the brain from the skull bone and the spinal cord from the vertebral column. This figure tries to show all the different three meningeal layers and their relation with the brain and the skull bone. So the one in close contact with the brain, the cerebral cortex, is the pia mater, which is the innermost meningeal layer. Then above the pia mater, there is the arachnoid mater, and above the arachnoid, the outermost meningeal layer is the dura mater. So from superficial, that is from outer to inner, the first layer is the dura mater, the outermost layer. Then the arachnoid is the middle layer, and the pia mater is the innermost layer. Now these layers, they have three clinically very important potential spaces. That is the epidural above the dura mater, subdural below the dura mater, and the subarachnoid below the arachnoid mater. So these are the different spaces. We'll discuss them in detail also later. So the function of these meninges, basically they are protective in nature. They provide a protective covering to the brain and the spinal cord, which are the vital organs, vital centers of the body from mechanical traumas and injuries. They support the blood vessels, supplying these important structures, and they also help to form continuous cavities through which the cerebrospinal fluid will circulate, will pass. Again, a figure that shows the different meningeal layers and their location with the skull bone and the brain, and it also shows the different spaces, the subdural, the subarachnoid space. So today we'll discuss about the dura mater. The dura means hard and mater is mother. So it is the hard outermost, most thickest and toughest membrane that covers the brain. So dura mater again is divided into two layers. That is the outer endosteal layer, which is in connection with the skull bones or with the endosteum or the endocranium, and the inner meningeal layer which surrounds the brain. It is continuous with the spinal dura mater. So these two layers, the endosteal and the meningeal layer, they are fused with each other at all places except for those places where the cranial venous sinuses are enclosed. So when we had studied about cranial venous sinuses, we had discussed that these sinuses are present in between the two layers of the dura mater. So except for these places, rest everywhere the two layers of the dura mater are in close contact. They are continuous with each other. This image is basically showing one of the foldings of the dura mater. So first is the endosteal layer of the dura mater. It is that layer which is continuous with the periosteum lining outside of the skull. So endosteal layer is the layer that lines the inner surface of the skull bone, and it also continues with the periosteum, that is the outer covering of the skull bone, with the help of the various sutures and foramens present in the skull bone. And it is also continuous with the periosteal lining of the orbit with the help of the superior orbital fissures. This layer, it provides sheaths for the various cranial nerves. These sheaths, they will fuse with the apineurium outside the skull, so it will fuse with the covering, outer covering of the nerves. Over the optic nerve, we had discussed this when we were studying the anatomy of the eyeball. So the optic nerve also has a sheath of dura mater around, which later becomes continuous with the sclera. So the outer surface of the endosteal layer will become adherent. It will stick to the inner surface of the cranial bones with the help of many fine fibrous and vascular processes. And the adhesion, it will be seen, it is seen to be most marked where the sutures are present or at the base of skull and also around the foramen magnum. Next is the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Now this layer of the dura mater is present, it is folded on itself and it forms partitions which divide the cranial cavity into various compartments, and they lodge the different parts of the brain. So these foldings of the meningeal layer of the dura mater are the falx cerebri, the tentorium cerebelli, the falx cerebelli, and the diaphragm celli. We'll discuss them in detail one by one. That is, first is the falx cerebri. So it is a sickle shaped fold of dura mater. It occupies the median longitudinal fissure which is present in between the two cerebral hemispheres. It is the fissure that divides the two cerebral hemispheres into right and left portions. So that fissure is the location of this falx cerebri. It has an anterior end which is narrow. It is attached to the crista galli of the ethmoid bone, and the posterior end is broad. It is attached to the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli in the mid plane, in the median plane. So the figure, this is the falx cerebri. This is falx cerebri. It is a sickle shaped exactly in the midline. Its anterior part is narrow and it will be related with the crista galli of the ethmoid bone, and its posterior part, which is broad, it is related with the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli. This is the tentorium cerebelli, and in the mid plane, the posterior end of the falx cerebri, it is continuous with the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli. Same you can see in the figure. This is falx cerebri. This is the attached margin of the falx cerebri. This is the free margin of the falx cerebelli. Anterior end is related with the crista galli, and posterior end of the falx cerebri is related with the tentorium cerebelli, the upper surface. Upper margin of the falx cerebri is convex. It is attached to the lips of the sagittal sulcus, and along its upper margin there is the superior sagittal sinus. Lower margin is concave, it is free, and along its lower margin there is the inferior sagittal sinus. This we had discussed also when we had studied about the cranial venous sinuses. So this is falx cerebri. This is the upper margin which is convex and it contains the superior sagittal sinus. This is the lower margin which contains the inferior sagittal sinus, and this is free, this is attached. In this, this is the skull vault, the skull cap, and you can see here the lips on which the falx cerebri, the upper margin, is attached. There are two surfaces of the falx cerebri, and each surface corresponds to the medial surface of the corresponding cerebral hemisphere. So it has two surfaces, right surface and left surface, and they correspond with the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The straight sinus, it lies at the line of attachment of the falx to the tentorium cerebelli. This also you can see in this figure. This is the line of attachment of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. This is the line of attachment, and you can see the straight sinus is present over here. Next folding of the dura mater is the tentorium cerebelli. As the name suggests, it is a tent-shaped fold, forms the roof of the posterior cranial fossa, separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobes of the cerebrum. It separates the cerebellum and the occipital lobes of the cerebrum, and it divides the entire cranial cavity into an upper part, which is the supratentorial part, and a lower part, which is the infratentorial part of the infratentorial compartment. So the area above the tentorium cerebelli is the supratentorial compartment, and the area below the tentorium cerebelli is the infratentorial compartments. And then they contain different structures accordingly. So this is exactly where the tentorium cerebelli is present, and you can see with the help of this line, it's trying to show the supratentorial and the infratentorial compartments. So the area above this black line is the supratentorial compartment, and area below is the infratentorial compartment. And also you can see that this tentorium cerebelli separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobes of the cerebrum, and they form the roof of the posterior cranial fossa. The same with the red line. This is the red line is the tentorium cerebelli, and how it divides it into the supratentorial and the infratentorial compartments. This is again tentorium cerebelli, forming the roof of the posterior cranial fossa. Again the same cut portion. This is tentorium cerebelli. From this side it has been cut to show the posterior cranial fossa. So if this is the posterior cranial fossa, the membrane above is forming the roof of this fossa. Again a figure that shows all the different foldings of the dura mater, that is the falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, and the diaphragm celli. The margins of the tentorium cerebelli, it also has free and attached margin. So the free margin is anterior margin is U-shaped, and the ends of that U are attached anteriorly to the anterior clinoid processes, which are related with the sphenoid bone. So these are the margins of the tentorium cerebelli, the free U-shaped anterior margins that are attached anteriorly to the anterior clinoid process located on the sphenoid bone. These are the anterior clinoid processes on which the free anterior margin, the U-shaped margin is of the tentorium cerebelli is attached. Also the same you can see in the figure. Attached margin is convex. Posteriorly and laterally, it is attached to lips of the transverse sulci on the occipital bone and on posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone. So you can see that the attached posterior lateral part of the tentorium cerebelli is attached to the lips of these. This is a transverse sinus, and in the area where it is located is the transverse sulcus. Anterolaterally, it is attached to superior border of the petrous temporal bone and to posterior clinoid processes. So these are the anterior clinoid processes and these are the posterior clinoid processes. So this is the anterolateral part of the attached margin, and it is related with the superior part of the petrous temporal and to the posterior clinoid process. And along the margins, there are the transverse and superior petrosal venous sinuses. This is the transverse sinus along the posterior lateral part, and along the anterior lateral there is a superior petrosal sinus. Surfaces are two again. The superior surface is convex, slopes to the either side from median plane. Falx cerebri is attached to the surface right in the midline, and along that attachment between falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli there is the straight sinus, and this surface is also related with the occipital lobes of the cerebrum. Inferior surface on the other hand is concave. It lodges the superior surface of the cerebellum. So the superior surface of the cerebellum is convex. So in order to lodge that convex superior surface of cerebellum, the inferior surface of tentorium cerebelli is concave, and to this inferior surface the falx cerebelli is attached. To the posterior part of the inferior surface, the falx cerebelli is attached. Now falx cerebelli again, it resembles the falx cerebri, that is, it is also sickle shaped in the midline, but it is small. Falx cerebri is larger, it is smaller, it projects forwards into the posterior cerebellar notch. So this is the falx cerebelli projecting into the posterior cerebellar notch from the inferior surface, posterior part of the tentorium cerebelli. It arises. The base of this is attached to posterior part of inferior surface of tentorium cerebelli in the median plane, and the apex divided into two parts, and they are lost along the sides of the foramen magnum. So this is the base, and this would be the apex, which will be lost after dividing into two parts along the foramen magnum. So there are two margins, posterior and anterior. The posterior margin is convex. It is attached to the internal occipital crest and it encloses the occipital sinus. So the posterior margin is related to this part, which is the internal occipital crest. That is the posterior margin, and it would enclose the occipital sinus as the name is suggesting. and the anterior margin is concave and free. This is Fox cerebelli here. And this is the apex, which divides into two parts and get lost along the foramen magnum. The anterior margin would be the one that is facing to this side. It is concave, free, and posterior margin is attached, and it is attached along this internal occipital crest in which the occipital sinus lies. Diaphragm celli is another fold of the dura mater. It is small, circular, it is an horizontal fold, and it forms the roof of the hypophyseal fossa, where the hypophysis cerebri is present, anteriorly attached to the tuberculum celli and posteriorly attached to the dorsum celli. On each side, it is continuous with the dura mater of the middle cranial fossa, and it has a central aperture through which the stack of the hypophysis cerebri passes to reach the third ventricle of the brain. That's the hypophyseal fossa, where the hypophysis cerebri is present, and this is how the diaphragm celli forms the roof. Its attachments are dorsum celli and tubercular celli. In between, you can see the central aperture through which the apex of the hypophysis cerebri passes and reaches the third ventricle of the brain. This is the stack. It is passing from the central aperture. This is the diaphragm celli. The membrane that you can see here in this figure is the diaphragm celli, and it becomes continuous with the dura mater of the middle cranial fossa. Forms the roof of this. This fossa here is the hypophyseal fossa, where the hypophysis cerebri is present. This is the tubercular celli, and this is the dorsum celli, to which the diaphragm celli is attached anteriorly and posteriorly. So that's all for today's lecture. Remaining portion will be discussed in the next lecture. Thank you so much.